Welcome everyone to University Church and the Notre Dame Newman Center for Faith and Reason. This is the first talk we're giving this year. We're excited to have you all with us. We know that since the time of the Old Testament, people have been writing about, and from a religious perspective, a spiritual perspective, the care of the environment around us. They wouldn't have used those terms, but we read it across wisdom and in some of the other books. We know that St. Francis was deeply devoted to the world around him, the created world, and called us to be mindful of our environment and the created world. We know that over the last 10 years or so, Pope Francis has been endlessly calling us to reflect on our stewardship of that which we've been given as a great gift. In Laudato Si, in the follow-up document especially, but he hardly goes a week without talking about it in some way. We are privileged and honored here in the season of creation to start our lecture series this year with a presentation by Mariana Silva. Many of you know her as the young woman who reads at the evening mass, but as a doctoral student at Trinity, as someone deeply concerned about the peatlands of Ireland. She is often knee-deep in her work. So I'll let her explain a little bit more about who she is and why she's here, but it is my pleasure to welcome Mariana Silva.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay? Lovely. So, welcome in this evening. I'm aware it's not the nicest out right now, but I was just saying to Adam as we were coming in, this is like perfect bog weather, so we're off to a good start. I'm Mariana. I came from Notre Dame, and I moved to Ireland about 3 years ago, exactly 3 years ago. I studied environmental engineering in Notre Dame. I studied environmental engineering in a master's program at Trinity, and now I'm studying environmental engineering in a PhD also at Trinity. So I've been stuck in with environmental work for a very long time, and it's much more recently now that I've started to get much more into the topic I'm going to be introducing to you guys today, which is bogs, and a little bit more. So the inspiration for the title of this talk came from something I did my senior year at Notre Dame. Was a program called the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. They had a research experience for undergrads where you were paired up with different PhDs or fellows at the university, and you helped them either catalog work or you would research for them and present findings so they could incorporate it into books and theses, things like that. And by the end of mine, I had done a couple projects with a couple of the fellows, a part of the Institute, and I'd also done some ecological theology work as well. And we would convene and talk about our reflections on our work and how that might influence our own research in the future. And we had little awards at the end, unofficial ones, given to everybody. And if you can't read it, mine says that I was awarded the annual Most Likely to Convince You That Peat Bogs Are Beautiful award. And it started from there. Even before I'd come to Ireland, I was interested in wetlands, which I'm going to talk about a little bit first. And then I'm going to give you the basics on bogs specifically. I'll talk about my PhD, and then we'll get dig in a little bit more into the theology and the why of all of this work. So wetlands. I've been interested in wetlands pretty much my entire academic career, post-high school, probably started more so towards the second half of my academic career. But I think this was kickstarted by, I did a program in the northeast of Wisconsin, right on the border almost with the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and almost Canada at that stage, called the University of Notre Dame Environmental Research Center, or UNDERC for short. That was my first time that I was studying wetlands. They were not bogs, but we had plenty of bogs around. You'll see pictures from some of those sites in the backgrounds, a lot of these slides. I also spent some time right before COVID taking a course run by Notre Dame. It was a interdisciplinary course called, oh my gosh, Integral Human Development, Peace, Ecology, and Integral Human Development, which took us to Uganda for a week right before COVID hit. And so we were kind of nervous about how we were going to get back, but we were able to see the wetlands of Uganda and also the source of the Nile, which is where I'm sitting at the bottom there. So I have a few more examples of things that I've seen. It might not appear the best on the screens. Hopefully you can see relatively well, but on this corner, we've got papyrus, very, very tall vegetation. Papyrus swamps are probably the very, very beginning of wetlands in human history, if not Earth's history. We've got a quaking bog here, which I also show up here, which is a type of bog where the vegetation is so matted together and tightly woven together that water can sit underneath it, and it feels kind of like a trampoline or a waterbed. And you also are at risk of punching all the way straight through and getting stuck underneath. Here's another example of a treed bog. These are both in Wisconsin, and one on a lake's edge as well. I also decided to add a little snake to scare you guys in case. I know we don't have those here. So we're on to Wetland 101. I just want to give you guys some basics. I found this graphic on Twitter. I like it a lot. So first and foremost, each one of these designations is a wetland. Not all of these are peatlands, which is what Father Gary was saying that I study, which is correct, before. So different kinds of wetlands are described using different terminologies depending on whether or not you're looking at it from an ecological perspective or a scientific or an engineering perspective. So the top two here, we're comparing acids versus bases. The reason why this happens, why you might have something like a bog that's very acidic, is also based on its physical situation in whatever country you're looking at, and also how old it is, which I'll talk about in a little bit. A fen, this is talked about less. We have very, very few in Ireland, but there were a ton at some point. There also were a ton in England once upon a time. A fen has a little bit taller vegetation, but that doesn't really matter because what we really care about is the fact that it's alkaline, it's basic. So there's typically more minerals, more nutrients, and so more plants can grow. We have then these terms, which are a little bit more, I guess, subjective in nature, and also something you might see from an ecological standpoint. We've got swamps and marshes. Swamps, you've got trees, and you might think of the Everglades in Florida or down in Louisiana, where you've got big, tall, foreboding-looking trees, and then very muddy, almost lots of pools of water, very sticky-looking. Marsh is kind of a catch-all for everything else. So we have coastal marshes, we have salt marshes. Sometimes you can also consider a fen to be a marsh, depending on what you fancy for the day. But these are the main criteria for wetlands. These up here are peatlands, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more. Firstly, because I'm American and we can't describe anything in metric, we have to use some sort of analogy. I might be using some statistics here that are in hectares, which is this square here. It's technically 100 meters by 100 meters, but what we care about is that it's just about larger than the size of a football field. The main things, again, this is Wetlands 101, basic. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on Ireland. We've got 1.5 million hectares of peat soil in Ireland. Peat soil doesn't necessarily need to be a bog or a fen. It can just be the type of soil that's underneath pasture, or it's underneath forestry, or it's underneath your house. Peat soil. Of that 1.5 million, that's around 23 of the total land area of Ireland. We used to think it was 21. That figure has gone up just a little bit in an updated map. We've got 482,000 hectares that is specifically raised bog, and this is the type of bog that I study. Not only is it acidic, because very little gets to grow there, but also it's growing, you will see this a little bit in a future slide, in the middle of the country, where there's very steady rain, very light rain, and it's very flat compared to, say, the Wicklow Mountains or Connemara. And so they are able to grow in a manner which is raised, and we'll see that in a bit. I'm not sure if any of you might be familiar with that from your own experience. That is around a third of all the total peatland area is raised bogs. And then we even zoom in a little bit more, and we are getting into Bord na Móna owned area, which I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with Bord na Móna, but I'll be talking about them in a little bit as well. Bord na Móna owns 80,000 hectares of raised bog, which is around 17% of the total raised bog area, which is a good chunk. And of that 80,000, 33,000 hectares, which is around 40%, around 41%, is being rehabilitated through the PCAS program, which started around 2021. So that's a good chunk as well, of the good chunk, of the good chunk, and then you can keep going back from there. I'm very interested, I'm showing this all to you because I research 5 sites within this PCAS rehabilitation program. So I gave you a bunch of fast facts. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about bogs. Here I've got an example. This is in Clara Bogs, sorry, in Offaly, just south of Clara town, if you've ever been there, or you've passed through with a train. This is our best, our nicest, our prettiest example of raised bog in Ireland, which I have some prettier pictures, I have some less, but at the end of the day, what a bog should look like is kind of like this. So I want to give you guys maybe like 30 seconds to just think to yourselves, how does this make me feel? You can like internalize it, maybe give yourself an adjective. And then I'm going to give you a few more examples. Nope, other way. I've got an example here of a fen, a swamp, and a bog. I want you guys to think about how this makes you feel. Perhaps consider some adjectives. Personally, I got these pictures from Pinterest, so they're all a little bit more aesthetic, perhaps, than some of the other ones that I've taken. I think, especially the one in the middle, is beautiful. But I think there's some element of it that if you're looking at it, compared to maybe being in it, you'd feel a little bit differently, which is also something I want you guys to consider. Do you feel safe in this type of environment? Okay, keep that in the back of your head. I'm going to talk again about raised bogs. So the example that we had of Clara before forms a little bit like this. I've gotten these graphics from, we did in 2022, in the summer of 2022, right before Notre Dame had a big football game in Ireland. We did a little expose on a bunch of different Irish cultural stories and across the country, and it was run by the Notre Dame communications team. So they came in, there's me, they came into Ireland with all their camera crews and their trucks, and I brought them out to Clare Bog to show them around to some of the different older research sites that Trinity had been using for various reasons, be looking at either vegetation, mapping vegetation, or looking at water levels, carbon, all these different things I'll talk about later. And from that, they developed this little story, which I have a link up at the top. You might get the slides later if you care. They did a little story showing my experience with the research and then also the experience of a turf cutter in the west of Ireland, and knit that together really nicely. So they created this lovely little graphic of how a raised bog grows. And now we're considering here millennia. So we've got, let's say this is right after the last ice age. We have an open pond or an open lake. It's a big, big area that's been carved out by a glacier. And then over a very, very long time, we have this process called sedimentation that if you can see this little sliver of slightly darker soil that's been settling out towards the bottom. It's also reducing the total area or total volume of water that's in this lake. And more different types of vegetation can start to encroach on that sort of slippier, siltier soil that it might prefer. And that is the beginnings of, you've got your marshes, your wetland vegetation in there. Eventually, it's going to fully terrestrialize. It's going to fully sediment up into, I don't know what you would call it, some type of wetland, but it's not a bog yet, because next you need to get fully vegetated cover, and eventually this vegetation is going to grow and die over thousands of years. And that plant material isn't going to go anywhere, because like I was saying before, it's so acidic, there's very little nutrients, very few minerals, and it's very consistent rain, very consistent conditions, everything just gets stuck. And that's how we end up with our bogs in the middle of the country. They get a little bit taller, and if you go out towards the center of a bog, which I mean I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but if you get to the middle, everywhere else will look slightly lower because you are actually physically raised. They form this dome, which I have an example of here. So we've got peat underneath as well. That is, in a ecological succession point of view, what we would consider fen peat. So fens might come before bogs, where there were more nutrients once upon a time. And then, as that vegetation grows and dies, the vegetation that can still handle there being fewer nutrients in the soil take over, and then we end up with bogs. I have here, this is a pretty famous map of well, if you're a peatland researcher, this is a famous map of Ireland, because this was done by Connolly and Holden in about 2008, I think, 2008, 2009. We're showing generally the peatland area for the entirety of Ireland, all of Ireland. And that was pretty new and pretty high tech for the time. And all of these estimates had to come from satellite acquisitions, surveying on the ground, to make sure that you were getting a decently accurate estimate of each one of these teeny little blobs of like, okay, what kind of peatland is that, and where is it extending? Some of this area might be underneath agricultural soil. How do you identify that kind of peat? What I'm showing here is, if you can't read these tiny legend in the bottom, I don't blame you, the words in the legend, we have examples of blanket bog, which is this reddish, all along the mountainous areas of Ireland, if you're familiar with the topography of Ireland. And in the middle here, in orange, we have raised bog, and tiny bits, which is not really easy to see here, of fen, where fen would probably be on the outskirts of where raised bogs might still exist. And this was pretty revolutionary because we were able to really have an idea of how much this soil was contributing to climate targets. We were thinking about this even, pre-2010. So that was our expose on wetlands, on what a bog is. Now I also want to consider how we have related to bogs since God knows when. Starting with, if you remember from our raised bog growth figure, starting with glaciation. So I'm going to try to go through this slide in like 2 minutes, and I'm going to try to explain around 20,000 years worth of human history. This is not my field of research. I am an engineer. So if there's any anthropologists or historians in the room, I'm sorry. However, I think it's still very relevant because it explains something about life and about death that I think is very, very crucial to the study of peatlands. So, glaciation. Way back when, all of Ireland was effectively covered in a massive glacier, miles, kilometers high. And over a number of millennia, those glaciers scoured the earth as they melted and retreated. And now we have, our ice caps, and we have our Iceland, and you can still go and see them, but you might want to go soon because they might be melting. And the landforms that were left by this glaciation are what have continued to shape the landmarks that we see today. However, it's not like we're seeing these giant depressions where the glaciers were formed, or where the glaciers formed because something else was formed where that empty space was left behind. And spoiler alert, it was bogs, among many other things, but bogs especially. So we can see examples of this. This is an example I actually did steal from Iceland because it's a modern example of something you might have seen in Ireland a gazillion years ago. But what we have here are drumlins and esker ridges, which is something you'd learn in like a typical earth science course. It pretty much just means there's raised areas of tilled up earth that get left. And in a sort of pattern, you have pools of lakes that are also left behind. And then these pools eventually would become, like we saw before, our raised bogs that we're going to build up over thousands of years. So that is the beginning of the story of the bog, and it can seem like, oh, well, it was the end of the Ice Age, but it was also ushering in something new. And this was, you know, an era of rapid in terms of climate change. And then we get into prehistory, so now I'm skipping around 10,000 years, and we've reached a slightly more stable climate. We have humans in Ireland, and I wanted to point out in this era, we've got here a Neolithic example of a Neolithic settlement that you might see on the edge of a fen, that people had to contend with the very, very wet landscapes in Ireland to survive. People were using the reeds that you might find in a fenland to construct their homes. They were using the peat as walls, as mud walls, but also this was probably the main source, living on such an interface as you were. It's the main source of death for these people as well, because any prehistoric person who contracted malaria, which did exist in Ireland at the time, would have died effectively. And it was a very real threat, and I mean, some people might think this about today's bogs as well. It's a real threat that if you wander in, you won't figure out how to get out, and you might get stuck and die somewhere. So this was pretty much the effect of being an early person anywhere on Earth, but especially so in the wetlands. You not only had to contend with the natural resource to give you life, but also a natural hazard that could kill you. And then we zoom another like 10,000 years into written history. And maybe we'll excuse probably a lot of Irish history in here, but I wanted to highlight, interestingly, the coming of Christianity in Ireland, because we have an interesting pattern of the formation of monasteries in areas in Ireland that were accessible to the most people and that were safe for the most people in, you know, whatever conditions. Because again, we're still talking about between 500 to 1500 AD. There's still not much that people had to live on. So what we have here in the background, way back here, if you can see this brown blotch, is a bog. That's Mongan Bog in Offaly. And then this, if you can kind of see, is slightly raised, is an esker ridge, one of the things that probably would have been formed way back when. That esker ridge is what I think we call, what is it called? The Pilgrim's Way is what we, in modern days, have named it. And it was a road that was very, very often taken from wherever pilgrims or other, you know, travelers were coming from to get to Clonmacnoise Monastery in Offaly. And it was a safe route, it was a dry route, and it was pretty visible if you were going to be traveling along this esker ridge the entire way, rather than you see a bog to your left, you see a bog to your right. So it was also a way for people, the bog landscape was a way for people to find their way either to some sort of life-giving shelter or spiritual enrichment, and also it was perceived as a source of danger and of losing your way if you were to stray from your normal path. And then I'm going to skip forward slightly slightly less in terms of time-wise. We skip forward maybe another 250 years, and we get to the industrialization of Ireland. And what I find interesting about this is, I'm talking here around 1700 AD to present. If we look also at the industrialization of England before they came over here, we see a very similar pattern. They had a lot more fenlands over there, like I mentioned, and there was this extensive draining of fenlands in maybe 1500, 1600 in England before the English came to Ireland. Well, I guess maybe the English were probably already in Ireland, but before the English really started to drive forward production in Ireland by trying to also take command over the bog resource that we have here. So, all of this being said, England did bring what they at the time would have called innovation, they would have called technology, they would have brought their drainage networks, effectively, to create pasture land in Ireland. I wouldn't necessarily say that England were the ones who thought of this. I think this was already happening, but they had the resources to make it extensive and probably scaled up on their terms to make it profitable. So, what I have shown here is, this is actually a very recent picture. This is a little train that Bord na Móna, the Irish peat board company, which was founded, I forget, but in the 20th century, maybe 19th, late 19th, early 20th century, to systematize the burning of peat, the drying and burning of peat in order to heat people's homes, to connect to an electrical grid. They had this extensive train network that ran through the entire country of Ireland. And that, in its day, was a feat. It was an engineering marvel. It was the largest commercial train network in, I think, all of Europe, if not the whole world. So take that as you will. To them, it was amazing. And it definitely kept people warm and alive in a time when a lot of other rapid change was occurring. So that is human history from the perspective of bogs in approximately 2 minutes. I would definitely say, if you have more questions about that, to dig into it yourself. I'm not sure how useful I'll be in the question and answer. However, what I want you guys to garner from all of that is this idea that in bogs, there's always presented the options of life and death, and they're pretty thinly, there's a thin interface, a thin veil. The bridge connects effectively in a bog. And there's examples in literature as well for this phenomenon, you could say. It's a little dark over here, but I'll describe the different images that I've put on this side. On the top, we have the dead marshes from The Lord of the Rings, if anybody knows me. I love The Lord of the Rings. It was very interesting that Tolkien and a lot of other writers would use wetlands to convey suspense or fear, to convey memory as well, because it was something that, you know, this landscape could preserve something for a very, very long time. And that could be a way to teach your characters something that they might not otherwise have known if they hadn't stumbled into that specific environment. So we've got our dead marshes up at the top. We also have, and this is a fun little homage to Dante's Inferno, but we've got down here the river Styx, which Dante cleverly reimagined, not as a river, but as what he used in the Italian was palude, I think, which means marsh or swamp or bog, more so probably on the wetter, the swampy scale, because you still need to be able to navigate through it. So this was a literal depiction of the interface between life and death as a wetland. And it was the sullen in this, it was the fifth circle of hell, the sullen who were, you know, stuck in the mud and couldn't claw themselves up. And it was a very, very raw depiction of this struggle towards, is it going to be life or is it going to be death? So that was, I thought, pretty neat. We also have, if anybody else grew up around my time and was traumatized by the Never-Ending Story, either the movie or the book, we have the Swamp of Sadness. which was included in the book, which is quite literally you get dragged down by the mud. There's obviously magic involved, but another use of the suspense, of this fear that is presented by, not really knowing which step might sink you. And then finally, and this one is contested, so I think I just include this one for fun because I also heard it in a different peatland talk that I attended last year, is there are some translations of Exodus where the Reed Sea is described rather than the Red Sea for the crossing. I think it's probably debunked, but I think it's fun. Because we also have, this is a painting from, I forget which cathedral in the Vatican, but somewhere in Vatican City, in one of the beautiful churches in Vatican City, there's a painting, Renaissance era painting, where the parting of the Red Sea is depicted here. And you can see that rather than the water being sort of clear and crystal, like you might imagine for an ocean, it's very dark, it's very red, very brown. And I mean, probably that's blood, probably it's a bunch of other things, but I also think it's kind of fun to imagine perhaps that they were wading through papyrus and that he was able to part the papyrus rather than the sea. But take that as you will. A lot of these examples were taken from this lovely book called Fen, Bog, Swamp by Annie Proulx, who wrote Brokeback Mountain. Don't know, she had like a COVID, lot of time on her hands and decided to get really into wetlands. But she describes the English fens pre-industrialization and also describes how a lot of the people who were protesting the drainage of these fens were the poor and the considered a low social class. So that's definitely something we see mirrored in this, the industrialization of Ireland and colonialism. And she also explains a few other examples of this suspense in writing, including the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Hound of Baskervilles, where there's a false step that means death to man or beast within a mire, and a few other examples which I thought were really fun. If anybody, I have a bunch of books here, if anybody wants to borrow them, let me know. So, all of this being said, we have now been considering how life and death, from our perspective, is perceived when we think of a bog, but also it's worth it, and this is where my work comes in, to consider that bogs themselves are living and are dying. So I gave a little bit of a statistical background in the past of simply the situation of where bogs are right now. However, the history is a little bit more stark. We have a near exponential decrease. This figure is also from 2014, so it's about 10 years old. There's probably somewhere some more updated figure that's maybe a little bit more sad, if you want to get more sad, that shows the decrease in raised bog area. This is the original area of uncut raised bog, circa 1980. This is 2013. And then, this is, who is this by? This is from Mackin et al. In 2015. Mackin further describes that not only is this uncut raised bog, but then this smaller figure, only 18,000, again we're talking in hectares, 18,000 hectares is from designated areas which are considered protected, so either an SPA or an NHA. And then this even smaller figure is something that we call active raised bog, which is the area which is currently accumulating peat and is going to be sequestering carbon by doing so. It's kind of grim. I have a few more statistics, if you bear with me through these. I have a few examples of different realms in which peatlands are deteriorating. So we've got here a hydrological example. In groundwater in fens, I sort of extended my reach here for an example. In groundwater in fens that have been drained, the groundwater response, i.e. flash flooding, is twice as fast as when those fens are restored. When we consider biodiversity, half of all the endangered bird species in Ireland depend on peatlands, on bogs or fens, for some element of their breeding cycle primarily. Some of them also like live on the area just in general. Less than 1%, which is this figure here, that's less than 1% of peatland area in Ireland, and that is the active area that's going to be sequestering carbon. And we've had 13 years so far of pressure from the EU saying we should be protecting this resource, some of which we've been heeding, some of which we've been a little bit slow on the come up. So this all leads into my work. You've sat here hearing me talk about all these other cool things. Now we get to talk about my actual work, which I would consider a subset of environmental engineering called ecological engineering. And this definition was coined by Mitch, and I forget the last, some Swedish guy, I forget his last name, but William J. Mitch is the main guy. And they came up with the definition that ecological engineering is the design of sustainable ecosystems that integrate human society with its natural environment for the benefit of both. So not only are we learning more about the environment, and we're also going to be harnessing it to our advantage in some way, but we're also understanding enough about the environment that we can alter it to its own benefit. And this is the book that it was based on. So my work is split into two key questions. I have, firstly, what's going on? I'm looking at these PCAS sites, if you recall, from Bord-na-Móna. These are ones that have been completely milled over, like we saw with that train, for probably about 20 to 50 years, depending on the site. They're very, very industrial sites. Most of them are still very, very dark black peat on the surface. Very little vegetation is starting to come in, but it's coming in very slowly. So it's a very new habitat, if you were to consider it that way. We don't really know what's going on yet. So we need to monitor it, some of which Bord-na-Móna are doing, some of which the EPA are doing, and they've come together to fund research from academic institutions to make sure that we can have a sort of third-party monitoring scheme that helps to supplement that. So we're going onto these sites, and we're, you can see in the little repeating video here, we're putting in instruments to check how the water is responding to different rain events. So we've got rain gauges and we've got piezometers, all these things I'll explain in a sec. And we also are noting spatially how the vegetation is changing. And then, this is probably the harder part of the PhD, if you didn't think this was hard already. I'm going to be trying to put together a model which is going to predict from, say, about now. We can spin up, which is the technical term for, we're going to tell the model what's been happening to this specific site that you give it from, say, the past 100 years when it was a bog, when it was cut, and then we let the model predict how this ecosystem is going to respond until it reaches some sort of stable state. Whether or not that means, we keep calling these sites bogs, but there's a chance that it's going to revegetate into an open lake because they didn't, the engineers, when they were putting in all of the different drain blocks and weirs, didn't get their calculations right, and it just completely, that's not going to happen. But it could. Things like that is what the model might try to predict. Because once we can figure out what a stable state might look like, does it look like the way a fen would look? Or does it look like a treed bog that you might see in Wisconsin or Sweden? Things like that. Then we can say, what implications does that habitat have for Ireland's future, either for climate change and carbon emissions accounting, or we can say for biodiversity. So these are my two main goals. This is the title of my dissertation, although it's only halfway done, so I guess it's TBD, could be changed, but it's technically process-based modeling for long-term projections of rehabilitated raised bog ecohydrology. So, process-based modeling is the type of modeling I'll show in a bit. That basically is just the type of software we're using and how it's structured. It's going process by process, physically based on what's going on in the actual environment. Then we've got long-term projections. That's what I was just talking about with our stable state. For rehabilitated raised bogs specifically, so that means we're looking only at the ones in the PCAS program. I don't care too much about, say, our Clara bogs that still have vegetation on the top. We're looking at these really destroyed ones that are pretty much going to fundamentally change in the next 10-ish years. And the term ecohydrology is a great one, in my opinion, because it encompasses not only what the engineers like, what we engineers enjoy, which is just how the water's moving, where it's going, what the water level's at, because that is going to be our control, that's going to be our limiting factor. As long as we get the water table right, you know, it's this high above or below the surface, then everything else is going to sort itself out. The ecohydrology means we still need to know how that's going to feed into how vegetation is going to grow, what types of animals are going to come in, and then how that in turn is going to impact, once again, the water and the hydrology. And it's a lovely little loop. So that, in very, very short, is my thesis. It involves field work, first and foremost. If anybody has been talking to me anytime this summer, I pretty much have always been saying, oh, I was out in the bog last week, consistently, because I do this every other week. It's mostly, again, this monitoring scheme, this first lobe of the project where I am focused on 3 separate, distinct sort of categories that you might want to evaluate when you think of environment. If you want to look at environmental science, you're looking at carbon emissions. So we have this thing over here is a Lacor brand portable carbon dioxide and methane gas flux analyzer. So pretty much if you can imagine gas coming up like this, it can measure how fast it's doing that and in what quantity. That, and then I also have this tiny graph which is showing when you close a chamber, which is back here, it can track how fast that gas is moving and quantify that. That's going to give us these spot locations, real time, every time I'm out there, a different emission that can then be knitted together to provide a full picture of how the bog is responding in terms of carbon in the long term. However, again, there's a lot of nuance to that, so feel free to ask me more questions if you'd like. The next lobe, I don't know what else word to use for that, is the hydrology, the water level. So this is where my project has its foundation. We're all hydrologists. So we're sort of still starting everything from that central axle, and then the emissions and everything else is sort of informed by the hydrology. But we have this extensive network of these things called piezometers. I have show and tell. Which is this little slotted tube that you stick into the ground, and you have a sensor in here that's measuring the pressure above which water is pushing down on it. And that way, you're able to see technically where the water is relative to the soil surface after you do a little bit of math. So that's important, and we have these dotted over these like huge, huge sites. You know, they're probably the size of like, you know, somebody's farm or even bigger. And we maybe will have like 10 to 40 on a given site. And that work, thankfully, is assisted by Board and Mona, so I don't have to be going to each individual one every single time I'm there, which would take me forever. And then finally, we're also looking at water quality. So I'm going out and I'm taking little samples, little vials of water at what we're looking more specifically at is the outlet. At the outlets of the sites so that we can, again, over the long term, once we gather up enough of these samples, we can get a good picture of the dissolved carbon. And then also, if we wanted, we could look at nitrogen, we could look at ammonia, things like that. These indicator nutrients that could be impacting the downstream of the bog. So if somebody's neighboring farm is concerned about whether or not they're going to be getting this influx of nutrients if new vegetation are going to be growing on the bog when otherwise there used to be nothing there because it was an industrial site, we can try to tell them, oh, you don't have to worry about that, or oh, you might want to worry about that, make a buffer zone, something like that. So those are the 3 monitoring aspects of my work. I have a little map of all my sites. These squiggly lines are what I drew in on my tablet for the delineations between the counties. Sorry about that. I have 5 sites spread all across the Midlands. Not efficient on my part when we were assigning these sites to myself, because every single day, not every single day, every single time I'm out in the field, I go to 2 of these in a day. And I'm coming from Dublin, and I go to one, and I go to the other, and then I come back. And we've got 3 in Offaly, 1 in Galway, and 1 all the way up here in Longford. I'm not sure if anybody would happen to be familiar with these areas, or if they're nearby anywhere where you grew up or your auntie grew up or something like that. But we've got Clunini Bog just outside of Longford town. We've got Castlegar Bog, which is kind of close-ish to Ballinasloe. We have Ballycon Bog, which is right near like Mount Lucas, which is where the big wind farms are now, in East Offaly. We have Ballahurt, which is just south of Athlone, and All Saints Bog, which is one of the sites that there's also protected bog area right next to it, so that's a little bit interesting for us, which is kind of close to Forbane in Offaly as well. So then, after probably 2 years of doing this work, I get to, well, I'm developing it at the moment as well, but I get to put all of that lovely data into a model, which I'm not going to explain all of this, but has multiple different layers to it, because not only do I get this data, I get this hydrological data, we can run that through a model that's going to get a relatively good routing map of where the water's going at any given time for the couple of years that we've been monitoring it. And then we can also take the carbon dioxide and the methane data, and we can match that up with our vegetation mapping data and create some sort of index that shows relative change of vegetation and how that maybe associates with relative fluxes of carbon dioxide and methane. And we can maybe have proportioned areas of, if you have this much area of this type of plant specifically, it's going to be emitting this much methane. And you can knit all of that together to give some decent spatial estimate for the emissions from a specific site. And that might be useful in the validation of, say, a model that's going to predict how vegetation is going to grow. You have a lot of other elements, some of which include machine learning, some of which include me tapping aggressively on a spreadsheet to make sure all of the data looks nice before you can stick it through some of this. All of it gets scaled up into 2 big themes, one of which, like I was explaining before, is our process-based element. That's, let's say we're looking at soil erosion, and then that is described by one specific differential equation that then is discretized, it's turned into code, so then you can put that in a line of code and you can connect it to a different process, say that's rainfall trickling into the soil. And then that is also turned into a differential equation and discretized and stuck into your code. So each process is represented by math, effectively. And then all of that comes together when you run, and it hopefully works, for over a number of days or months or years, depending on the coarseness of your resolution. You can show how a specific 1D point or a specific 2D area is going to change over time. I have a few options for models I've been fighting with at the moment. I've been fighting with C++. It's a whole thing. And then what we're hoping to do is feed that information into what is probably the more speculative part of my project. I'm going to stick all of that information of this could be what happens, and then let it fly into a peat accumulation model, which is going to be looking over thousands of years to see in any of these active areas whether or not they're going to sequester carbon again, and how long that's going to take, and what Ireland might look like, 1,000 years from now if that were the case. And all of that is going to give us more information about the hydrology of these sites, of course, which is generally going to also validate what we've been seeing in the bogs, because we want to make sure that the model is realistic. And then it's also going to give us implications for how much carbon we're storing inside these sites, and also the emissions, if there are any, which there probably will be, either into the atmosphere or via water pathways out onto neighboring lands. So that's the gist of my project. Where all of this is going, of course, is we want to see, well, you can't necessarily say greener bogs because they don't always look green, but we want to see healthier bogs in the future. We don't necessarily want to keep all of our brown, bare peat areas bare anymore. There's enough literature that we know that that isn't useful. It's going to be a constant emitter no matter what, climate-wise, and no matter what type of vegetation you put on it, even if it's emitting vegetation, it's still a net positive. So we want to be doing something with these lands. We don't want to just leave them derelict and abandoned. There are ideas for what is a new field called paludiculture. It's like agriculture, but again with that palude, that Italian term that means marsh or wetland. It's specifically this agriculture on wetlands, which I think touches on this idea of ecological engineering that I was talking about before. We want to see how not only we can be responsibly using this land, but also giving it its own service back. You know, it's the type of vegetation that would be growing on these soils to begin with. I have an example down here of this type of agriculture. This is sphagnum moss. It's the main type of vegetation that would exist on a healthy bog. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant. And this all, what you would see up here, is called the capitulum. And all this underneath, because very little else can get through this layer, it all ends up just becoming decomposed sphagnum, and that's probably one of the #1 reasons why bogs are such good carbon sequester, carbon sinks, because all of this sphagnum on top is keeping everything wet, keeping everything soggy, and nothing's allowed to come in or out, which is great. I have a few examples of some of the high points of the field work that I've been doing, the happy zones, I guess you could say. Here we have an example of, this is where turf had been cut. I'm sure any of you who have cut turf in your past are familiar with walking up to a ridge of where the turf was cut up to maybe last year, and it's like, as tall as you of just peat. All of this now is being revegetated, which is great. What you can see here, this is cotton grass and some other types of rushes. Whether or not you can say that's good vegetation for the bog we're looking at, I would be arguing with other ecologists about. Here, this is in All Saints. We've got plenty of birds. I've seen dragonflies, frogs, all of these types of not only flora but fauna are very quickly returning to the site after probably only 3 years of revegetation. It didn't take too long. Everything's very eager. If they see a resource, that can bring about life, they're going to use it, which is great. And then here also we have an example of a drain that was blocked, and you can see, I hopefully think you can see, this weird little green stuff in there is a specific type of sphagnum, Sphagnum cuspidatum, which is really, really happy to grow very quickly in drains. And it's really promising to see in pretty much all of the drains on the margins of my sites, we're seeing this sphagnum popping up, which is great. So here's a little bit of a hydrological explanation for the drain restoration that occurs in Ireland. And I don't think I have time to get into this, but if we want to touch on it during questions, we can. This is a bit of an explanation also of the different types of rewetting and how that responds in terms of carbon emissions and different types of vegetation that would be responsible for that. So it's a big field of study, and we know a lot. What's tough is Bordamuna and the industrial scale of peatland cutting in Ireland is somewhat unprecedented. So the ways in which we need to revegetate to get back to this point, that sensitive area of the next like 10 to 30 years is the unknown, the big unknown. Here's a few more examples of my sites, in case you needed to look at more bogs. So this gets me into a little bit more on the reflections on what my work has taught me so far, even though I'm not even close to being done. And hopefully some other reflections I'd like to impart upon you. However much I've been talking about the PCAS program is, it's covering a huge area, and that's really great. It's a good chunk of the bog, which is a good chunk of the peatland, which is a good chunk of Ireland. There's still this glaring statistic, which is that a majority of the Irish bogs in, well, bogs in Ireland are privately owned. And this could mean, oh, you only have like a patch of bog on the side of your farm, and then the rest of it is public area or it's Bord na Móna area. But all those little bits potentially still count, and that's another reason why I think that people should really care about this, because it's not only Bord na Móna's resource, it's not only National Parks' resource, but it's yours as well. Again, I want you to consider what this image does for you in terms of maybe an adjective to describe it. I thought this was an interesting one to show because these fields might look like fields to you guys, and this would be potentially a field in rotation that didn't have any mowing or grazing on it for a year, but it's getting completely inundated at its lowest corner by what here is a solid fen wetland just off of Loch Smiley in Monaghan, if anybody's ever been there. This, to some people, might be, oh no, red flag, something's wrong with my operations in my field. It's flooding in this corner that becomes no longer useful. However, I do think that the same image can show a completely different story depending on who's looking at it. As a hydrologist, I say, oh cool, the wetland's working the way it should. And if we just created, if we just created a buffer zone somewhere along here, not only could the vegetation that grows there potentially assist whatever growth is occurring or whatever grazing is occurring on this field, but maybe we'll also have less inundation, less flooding that would be occurring to safeguard the rest of the field going forward. So there's different ways to think about the same image. I still think this image is very beautiful though. So now I'm going to get into, this is the last segment of the talk, and I have about like 3 to 5 slides left. Just talking about how all of this knits together into my perspective on bogs and why they're beautiful and why we should care in general about the environment as well, and how this very specific niche that I've gotten myself into has wide-ranging implications and is a lens for something much bigger. So most of this is taken from, I took a course at Notre Dame my sophomore year called Theology and Ecology by Father Terry Ehrman. And it's pretty much just the baseline background on this kind of work, which is nothing new. I'm not presenting anything new, but I would like to just show things that link up with my work that I think is fairly interesting. So, of course, Pope Francis produced Laudato Si in 2015, I believe, and it's been almost a decade now. It has, at least from the environmental standpoint, definitely revolutionized our idea of environmentalism and grounded it, rooted it in what is, it's just an encyclical, but it is adding to the tradition of environmental care and knowledge, which can then be used by Catholics going forward. We also read this book in the course called The Joyful Mystery. I have it here. Short, easy to digest, it's friendly even, and it gives a lot of really cool explanations into specifically the sort of philosophy or the reflections on Thomas Aquinas and looking at what they call green Thomism, or the environmentalism from the lens of Thomas Aquinas. And then this is a little bit of a denser book, but we have the resource Theological Foundations for Environmental Ethics by Jamie Schaefer, which goes very extensively through from the medieval era. Again, this idea of we're establishing a tradition within the church that it's already been there of looking at the environment through this stewardship lens, through this non-dominating lens. So I wanted to reflect on the theme for this year's season of creation, which was to hope and act with creation. I thought that linked up very well with my definition, or William J. Mitch's definition of ecological engineering. I happened in this theology and ecology course to write a paper pretty much extensively about prepositions. I found it, I have it. Um, because what's very interesting about the use of prepositions, not only in, say, the Bible, but also then in literature, theological literature, or quotes from theologians from the past or from saints, is it does matter which preposition you're using. So prepositions being in front of, or with, or behind, or on. And this all, in my opinion, centers on the verse Colossians 1:15 through 17, which I have somewhere. So it is, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And what's interesting about this is all of these, him obviously is God in this case. All of these are revolving around God. We're using God as a relationship consistently. And of course, I mean, if you go to Mass, that's something that we talk about in almost probably every homily. Father Gary can. There's some element of relationship that's very, very present in terms of spirituality and faith. We would be nothing if we weren't constantly relating to God and to Jesus and to the Trinity, and that can then extend to the world around us. Because I also included the Silmarillion here, because I did frame this entire paper around the idea of Ents as being the stewards of the forests in the Lord of the Rings, which I think is what we are for Ireland. Anyway, all of this can stem also from the idea of God simply as being. The burning bush that Moses encounters is a manifestation of the divine, right? And God says, I am. God simply is. And then everything else has being. And we are held into being because of God who is being. And that, from there, that, not necessarily philosophy, because it presupposes the existence of God, but is called creatio ex nihilo, which has been an idea that's been around since before the medieval times, I forget, maybe even the Greeks. That also is contested, but there's a lot of scholarly literature on that. And then from that, we can just open the floodgates into, okay, God is cool. How do we relate to this? If everything has being, and if God is holding everything continually into being, then that plant matters, and this flower matters, and the way that this water is flowing matters, and how I relate to that and how I change that matters. And it makes even like little things feel important and beautiful, and what Thompson, who wrote The Joyful Mystery, describes as awe-inspiring. Awe is a huge, huge factor in ecological theology, environmental theology, that people like to reflect on. I have, hold on, one more quote. So in terms of the idea of green Thomism that comes from, again, this Joyful Mystery book, we've got, again, this idea that, we have this relationship with God, and we're experiencing God. And I included a quote here, which you probably can't read, from the Summa Theologica, from Aquinas, which simply says, and I'll read it to you guys, some people presume to find fault with many things in the world through not seeing the reasons for their existence. And this is something I think whenever I look at these things, I'm obviously applying it to the lens of my research, and I say the idea of use of some of the sites that I visit is going to have to change, and it has changed already, but there's probably people in the neighborhood who would say, well, that thing isn't useful anymore. It doesn't need to exist anymore, or it's not existing for the way that I've seen it. So what now? He goes on to say, for though not required for the furnishing of our house, these things are necessary for the perfection of the universe. And I think that is environmentalism, but it was summed up by Thomas Aquinas like ages ago. So I thought that was very interesting. In the Theological Foundations for Environmental Ethics, we also go into this idea of use, describing heretics as those who especially fail to see the goodness of creatures and therefore disparage fire, cold, wild animals, and other natural entities. So anytime you're out in the bog and I'm getting rained on while doing my research, I can be thinking about that and saying this is also part of creation and I'm participating in creation. And finally, this was something, I don't have a reference, I'm done with quotes. This was something that was described in our course, but was generally the product of discussion from the course as well, was this idea of, in order to engage in the full mystery, the logos, that we contemplate as Catholics, there is this idea we have of the totality, which is just, you know? And in order to achieve this totality, we have simultaneously ecological and ecclesiological roles. We are among creation. We are with God. We are by God. We are participating in creation because we have being. So we are simply ecological, and we have to recognize that. But what's interesting about being human and having a faith is that we're also ecclesiological. We have this idea that all of this is with the end of the eschaton, you know, the end of perfect union. And we need that participation in the now and that constant drive and hope to then connect it with the end of redemption and salvation and eschaton. And that is fully participating in the mystery from some of these ideas of integral ecology and ecological theology. And all of it, I think, works very well with this idea of Bogs, because we are actively looking at the interface of life and death, whether or not we want to consider it from the risks that Bogs pose in the past, or the risks that we pose to Bogs now, going into the future. But also that interface of life and death can remind us of our faith. And simply, I would say, I want to leave you with this idea of what use is and how we can furnish our house, and to change your perspective on, say you're passing on the train through the Midlands, and you look out to your left and your right and you see a bunch of brown. Look a little closer, look a little inward, try to see what that is, what that's stirring in you, because it could be a changing aspect of your relationship with God. So that's all I have to say. Sorry that was long. Depending on how long I went over, I'm happy to take questions, but I will let Father Gary cut me off if I've been talking for too long.
Sure. We have time for just a few questions if anyone is interested. We'll ask you to use the microphone to ask them because this is also being live streamed. So.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's really great. I was just interested to know, you mentioned there the computer programming language C++.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, I'm a software engineer, so I was just wondering, why do you use that instead of maybe something like Python or something which is kind of easier? And I know like C++ is kind of used, I suppose. It's kind of maybe older, maybe a bit, I know it's used for high performance and all that, but I would have thought Python would have taken over that.
Good question.
Okay.
I would say this could be stubbornness on my part, but I've been operating on the principle, there's this idea in modeling of the FAIR principles, free, accessible, interoperable, and I forget what the R is, but something else. And so that is basically saying, when you can, try to use a type of model or try to produce a type of model that other people can use, so that you're not, putting things behind a paywall or making things difficult for anybody else to understand. So in keeping with that philosophy, I am trying to use pre-existing code and, mold that to my situation where it suits. So in this case, I'm looking at this process-based model called PVN, which is short for Peatland VUNUCOM, which was produced by some researchers based in the Netherlands. And they decided that they wanted to write it using Linux on a Mac. And now I'm like frantically asking friends like, hey, do you know how to get this onto my laptop? Or yeah, so I understand like, oh, it wouldn't be so much easier if you could make it, you know, on this nicer platform, but in keeping with the idea that we want to constantly be building off of other people's research, I wanted to try to use something that already existed.
You kind of mentioned it earlier, but I wonder, like you mentioned the fact that Bornamuna, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, they rehydrate the bogs. I'm sorry for how I
Rehabilitate,
yeah,
which I can talk a little bit about as well.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, can you kind of go into bit more details, not too much?
Of course, yeah, I'd be happy to. This is honestly probably something that people might be curious about if you've heard of Bornamona, but you haven't like been to see, like, oh, what's going on in the bogs there? So the term rehabilitation is used by Bornamona because so many of their sites are so degraded that you can't use the word restoration. We're not really sure if they're going to become bogs again. So they're saying we're at least going to be rehabilitating the habitat into something. So they're giving that a little extra wiggle room in terms of verbiage. The way that the engineers are doing this, Bornamona are contracting their existing diggers. So all the lads who would have been working on the bogs to extract them are also the ones who are now working on the bogs to rehabilitate them. Unfortunately though, for short-term contracts, so once a certain bog in their area has finished works for rehabilitation, they're let go, which is something that in terms of just transition needs to get sorted out. But all that being said, they're taking their big diggers out. We've got engineering drawings which have mapped out the topography of the site, and we've said, okay, in this area we want to create these little raised meter-high mounds called bunds. And we're going to create these bunds in like little, they look like giant pools, pretty much, with connecting what are called weirs. It's pretty much just like a triangle or a rectangle that's cut into the side of one of the bunds to let water pass in a network that gently flows towards the lowest point. So what you're doing by creating these bunds is you're at least slowing the water down. It's getting stored in these little cells of pools of water rather than all flowing off the bog very quickly, which is what was happening when they were draining them. They were intentionally creating these big channels that were going to let the water flow much more quickly off of the site and keep everything very dry. That make sense? Yeah.
Thanks for the very interesting presentation. If 69% of the bogs are privately owned, what is Bornamona or others, or the government, what's the advocacy piece, or how will you get people on board with this to actually expand the bog that's being rehabilitated?
I'm glad you asked that question because I wouldn't necessarily say that Bornamona need to be the ones that are responsible for that. And this is something that is a conversation amongst peatland people that are more than just like the scientists and the engineers. There's also very cool anthropologists and sociologists who study this field. I know a few at Trinity and also in UCD across Ireland that are looking at how communities are coming together to protect their wetland resources. So there is, if you've never heard of it, there's this organization called the Community Wetlands Forum. They do a lot of really good grassroots work. They go individually to Midlands towns or to Connemara towns and say, does anybody have a specific interest in your, local bog? Say it's an area that's been split up into, what's the word, parsonages maybe? And that typically the people would be cutting and say, are you interested in are we interested in changing the method of our ownership of this site? Because at the end of the day, and I think something that environmentalists aren't really the best at, and even Bornamona, because Bornamona have seen their sites as a commodity where it's like, oh, well, we'll do the restoration and then we're going to leave it because it's just a habitat. There's again, back to this relationship. There's not as much of a relationship. So the idea that communities can come together and use their resource, but just use it in a different way that not only serves you, but also serves that habitat would be, I think, the best way is completely sort of grassroots as much as possible. It's very idealistic to say that because I mean it's tough to get anybody to mobilize, but Community Wetlands Forum do great work, and there's more of that kind of stuff popping up here and there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting, Mariana. I have a question regarding my grandchildren. I have two twin granddaughters who are 16 now, and they are very idealistic. They want to do something to help the environment, and they're not sure what to study. And I would like to know, when you were 16 or whenever you made this crucial decision to take up,
environmental engineering, yeah.
Environmental engineering. What were the factors that pushed you in that direction rather than in any other?
Yeah, of course. I do remember this actually quite distinctly, being 16. I remember being in my math class and thinking to myself, talking to my other friends, I was a very good student by like the traditional standards. You know, I was able to get good grades in the right way and all that. So I was like, I'm going to be something that's impressive. You know, I'm going to go into STEM. And for a while, because I also was a little artistic on the side of that, so I was considering architecture. I was considering, you know, I could design some cool buildings and that, you know. But at the end of the day, I did really enjoy being in the environment, and it's nice to hear that your grandchildren are so idealistic. I wanted, in some way, my work to serve that end as well. And I mean, I remember just having this idea to myself that, oh, if I do architecture, then I'm either going to have to be like designing public bathrooms for a city, or I'm going to have to be like working for some really rich person and like feeling slightly, you know, guilty about building them their second house, you know? And there didn't really feel like there was any in between. So I thought to myself, okay, how can I apply this idea of design and creativity, but in a more service-oriented way? What's funny is I decided on environmental engineering before I truly knew what it meant, because I will say ecological engineering, everything that I'm showing you here is a subset. Environmental engineering is the more vital infrastructure that most of us like to ignore, like our sewers and our wastewater treatment plants and our dumps, things like that. That is, you know, that's environmental engineering. And then of course we get into renewable energy and we get into, you know, hydraulic engineering, things like that. But a lot of that it's not glamorous, it's not interesting. And then I just wiggled my way through here because I found research to be interesting, and I've managed, hopefully, to show there can be glamour in some of this work as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess if I were to suggest anything to them, I would just say, like, what is the end of the work that they're considering? Because you can get anything, honestly, to serve the environment at the end of the day, which is something I don't think I really understood when I was figuring this out. But like, try to see the types of jobs that people might get after a certain degree and say, like, is that serving the end that I see myself serving, I guess.
All right, I just want to thank Mariana, and we will be having tea and biscuits available in the back. Mariana will stay and answer any more questions we might have, but we think we should probably let folks go. Just know that in the weeks to come, we have more presentations coming. On October 23rd, Declan Khyber is going to be speaking on Newman and literature. He's a fascinating speaker and a beautiful writer himself. In late October, about a week or so later, we'll be having a storyteller come right on October 30th to tell stories, along with Steve Cooney, the musician, will be playing that night. And then a couple weeks after that, in early November, Richard Rollheiser will be giving our annual Newman Lecture, which is going to be, it's spirituality. He's a priest from Texas, and he'll be coming. He's pretty much in every newspaper, a Catholic newspaper around the world. So we hope that you'll be here for that as well. But right now, I'd like to thank Mariana for her talk and for exposing us to the beauty of Bogs.